We will stand up again. We will march again. We will preach again. We will organize again. We are black. We are white. We are Latino. We are Native American. We are Democrat. We are Republican. We are independent. We are people of faith. We are people not of faith. We are natives and immigrants. We are business leaders and workers and unemployed. We are doctors and the uninsured. We are gay. We are straight. We are students. We are parents. We are retirees. We are North Carolina, and we're here, and we ain't going nowhere.
Hello, I am T. Anthony Spearman, the pastor of St. Philip African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and the third vice president of North Carolina NAACP.
Hello, I'm Carolyn Q. Coleman. I'm first vice president of the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP branches. I want to welcome you to our Tomorrow Monday broadcast, and today we're going to be talking about voting rights, particularly in North Carolina. Dr. Spearman will lead us off with a discussion about the history of voting rights in North Carolina as it relates to the involvement of Bishop James Hood, a person who participated in the writing of the North Carolina State Constitution.
On the floor of the Constitutional Convention in 1868 in North Carolina, the Reverend, soon to become Bishop James Walker Hood, spoke the following words that I believe ought to be etched on the memory of every person of color. He said, and I quote, "Gentlemen of the convention, there has never been before, and there would probably never be again, so important an assemblage of the colored people of North Carolina as the present, in its influence upon the destinies of the people for all time to come. Let us have faith and patience and moderation, yet assert always that we want three things. First, the right to give evidence in the courts. Second, the right to be represented in the jury box. And third, the right to put votes in the ballot box. These rights we want, these rights we contend for, and these rights under God we must ultimately have." End quote. In his words, spoken over 146 years ago, we hear three pillars of public policy that would be used to unite whites and blacks fresh out of the ravages of the Civil War into a common bond to move forward and begin the arduous task of reconstruction in North Carolina and the nation. That valiant attempt at reconstruction would abruptly end around the turn of the century. A second attempt would take its place and include the civil rights era of the mid-1900s.
Following all of this that Dr. Spearman has just talked about, I want to talk about just a minute the history of the NAACP's involvement in voting rights. Of course, it began much, much earlier than I will talk about, but in 1963, Medgar Evers, who was the Mississippi State Field Director of the NAACP, working primarily throughout the state of Mississippi, but just really working to see that African Americans could register to vote. This was a state where African Americans in particular had to recite portions of the Constitution, portions of just about anything that they could come up with in order to register to vote. We're told that in Mississippi quite often they were asked questions like, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? And of course, if you knew the answer to that, you'd be a millionaire today. And so Medgar Evers worked to see that African Americans who were interested in registering to vote, and all of them at this time wanted to do that because they knew that this would make them a first-class citizen, that they would be able to register and vote. And so on the particular night that he was killed, he'd been at a rally trying to get people interested in going down to the courthouse on the following day to register and vote. Of course, that night as he came home, he was killed in his driveway by an assassin who was determined that African Americans would not have this right. We could fast forward right on to Dr. King's death, We could talk about many of the other people that have given their lives that we might have this right to register to vote, particularly in the South, where it was difficult for African Americans, regardless of whether they were in North Carolina or whether they were in Mississippi or Alabama, to be able to register to vote. I came to North Carolina in 1979, and I was told that in some counties in North Carolina, they would ask the question, are you left-handed or are you right-handed, if a person was trying to register to vote. And if they said, I'm left-handed, they were told, we're only registering right-handed voters today. And if they said, I'm right-handed, of course, they were only registering left-handed voters today. But North Carolina began to make progress following all of that and became known as one of the more progressive states under Governors Sanford and Hunt and others. And I came to North Carolina in 1979 excited about all of the progressive things that were happening here. And of course, from that time, we began to progress. But this past year in North Carolina, I believe we began to go backwards. We in fact became a bit worse than Mississippi in many ways, because the legislation that was passed here in North Carolina was just not representative of the kinds of things that we expected from our North Carolina General Assembly. And so, Reverend Spearman, tell us a bit about how Moral Monday came about in North Carolina.
Well, Moral Monday came about in North Carolina as a result of many of the attempts by the General Assembly to take us back, as in our perception we saw them doing, with so many different things that were transpiring. The denial of Medicaid to 500,000 people in the state of North Carolina, unemployment benefits being cut, the budget restricting a number of things that the schools were benefiting from, and just on and on and on. It was just a landslide of things that were happening in the state of North Carolina that was provided evidence that this General Assembly, this extreme group of individuals, was now coming in and doing away with all of the progress, it seemed, that had been made here in the state of North Carolina. And as Ms. Coleman has said, there were a number of progressive strides that had been put in place and that we were abiding by. But they were coming in, and now they're ravaging our state, and we're becoming an embarrassment across the whole country of the United States of America.
And that's so unfortunate.
It's very
unfortunate. I always brag to my NAACP friends across this country that North Carolina had same-day registration.
Yeah.
And of course, they've just taken that off the books completely. That was one of the more progressive things that was happening, not only in the South, but in this country, because they don't have that in a lot of northern or western states. And so we were proud of that. And then they reduced the number of early voting days by 7, so that people who are interested in voting early did not have as much time in order to do that. Sure. And then most importantly, of course, now they're saying you have to have a voter ID. And that has to be a state-issued voter ID. So you can't use that ID from work or even from school to register to vote. So North Carolina has just, as you said, become an embarrassment to us. And the NAACP thought that in order to protest, to let this General Assembly know that we are not satisfied with what's happening, we began the Moral Monday demonstrations. And I believe we're about week 80 or 81 in those demonstrations now. We've continued that across the fall, now across, of course, the summer and into fall again. Sure. So we're expecting that we're going to continue as long as the General Assembly doesn't change its ways. But we do have a lawsuit that's
but before you get to the lawsuit and the fact of the effectiveness of the Moral Mondays is showing forth also in the court system. that we have many of the cases now have been done away with or thrown out of court because they realized that our rights were infringed upon and not necessarily what the General Assembly was putting forward.
That's correct. And at this time, the NAACP has filed a suit challenging these laws that I've just spoken about. Tell us a bit about that, because there was an attempt to bring an injunction that you went to the court last week in Charlotte, I believe.
In Charlotte, yeah. Well, as you know, as a result of the decision that was rendered by Judge Schroeder in Winston-Salem, preventing the preliminary injunction, we appealed, and the case went before the Fourth Circuit Court in Charlotte last week. And just being there was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, wonderful experience. There were 3 judges who sat on the bench and questioned our attorneys and the state attorneys, and to find out, you know, what their position was, why they wanted to appeal this case. And some of the remarks that were being made by the judges, I mean, the judges, the 3 judges were Judge Wynn, Judge Motz, Judge Diane Motz, and I believe it was Judge Henry Floyd. And the only one that I was really knowledgeable of was Judge James Wynn. But the 3 of them, as far as I was concerned, asked some very, very important questions and brought up some very, very important things. For instance, Judge Floyd posed the question at some point when the state was talking about how burdensome it would be if they rendered a decision that turned over the decision of Judge Schroeder, and how they would have to go back, and they claimed that there was this 30-page document, a pamphlet that had been sent to all the voters. I haven't received mine yet, but had been sent to all of the voters that would detail what needed to be done for voting and what have you, and that would have to be taken back and redone and all of that. And the judges posed the question, well, what's going to have to be changed? It just seems to me that all of the biographies of the candidates, it would be the same. So what's going to have to happen? And so they posed the question, what harm is it going to present? And the state's attorneys could not answer the question. Well, then Judge Floyd came back with a question asking, well, does administrative burden trump constitutional rights? And I thought that was a valiant question. It was, I mean, it just changed the whole atmosphere in the court at the time that it was stated. And then there were some other statements that were made that were just, they were right on time. Judge Wynn came back and asked the question, well, why is it that North Carolina wants to keep people from voting? He outright asked that question. And so we're hopeful that the decision that they are in the process of making is going to be favorable. But even if it is not, you know, we are adamant that we're going to continue this battle because we know that the infringement upon us and what it does. See, some of the things that you said, Ms. Coleman, are evidence of the fact that it took from the time that Bishop Hood made his comments on the floor of the convention that year in 1868, that it would take 97 years of severe struggle, 97 years of crucial contending before the right to vote would become a reality for the black man.
Now, Dr. Spearman, we have about 35 days before November 4th when the actual election will take place. Do you think we'll get a ruling to give us an injunction prior to that?
Oh, I'm hoping so, and I'm believing so, because one of the things that the judges were pondering and shooting out there was the fact that everything that has been done in a timely fashion. Although, you know, it's taken a little time, but it's been done as expediently as it possibly could be done to see if we can get some things in place to go back and do things the way that they have been done. That was another issue that came up on the floor. The whole notion of status quo and what status quo meant. The opposition side claimed that status quo meant as soon as you put a law in place, that's what the status quo is. When our attorneys were arguing the fact that no, status quo is what has been in place for a period of time, and it seemed as if the judges, you know, my perception was that the judges seemed to be leaning toward our side. So I'm hoping that is going to certainly play out in this decision that we're hopeful to be receiving in the next few days.
Well, I'm excited about that possibility because when you say that in North Carolina, we're trying, based upon what one of the judges' question was, we're trying to stop people from voting. And in America, which really touts itself as being the land of the free and the home of the brave, would try to stop people from voting. It's just unimaginable that we're having to deal with this in a great state such as North Carolina. Now, as we look, however, at moving toward this next 35 days, we've got much work to do. I understand that there are 5 pages of ballot this year. You can no longer vote a straight party ticket in North Carolina, so you have to vote for each individual. And of course, that is going to discourage a lot of people.
It's going to be very
we have a major constitutional amendment that's on the ballot, and of course, by the time they get to the constitutional amendments, I'm concerned that people may have just given up and said 5 pages. That's just going to keep people in long lines.
But you know, one of the things that I have begun to suggest to people is to utilize their right to request an absentee ballot.
Yes.
Which will help them to negotiate their way or navigate their way through this new process. If indeed this process stays in place, then and they request an absentee ballot, what they can do is they can use the time that they have once they request the ballot to intellectually go through that ballot, those 5 pages, and by gaining information, knowledge, and insights as to who the candidates are, to take their time. They don't have to be compelled or thinking that they have to be restrained to a few hours or a few minutes in the ballot in the booth to do their voting and what have you, and their markings, but that they can take a little bit of time to ponder over what they need to ponder over.
And please remind them that if they do vote absentee, they must have two witnesses, or it must be notarized, because we don't want one witness signing that ballot. It will be discarded.
And the 2 witnesses must put their address on the ballot also.
Yes.
Or else it will be discarded.
That's correct. Now, but for those who want to vote on election day, we want to tell them that people in Florida stood in line for 4 hours waiting to vote. And so if you have to stand there a little longer, don't become discouraged. Just stand there and be determined that you're going to cast your vote.
But also utilize early voting.
Yes,
if indeed
definitely.
It's at all possible, utilize early voting, because that's going to be extremely helpful also, even though the number of days has been cut back. One of the things that what I'm going to do here at the church is offer rides to the church, and we're going to be mobilizing. I told my congregation yesterday, we're going to be mobilizing for the first day of voting, early voting. On October 23rd, we're going to rally here, we're going to get to the polls, and we're going to, en masse, we're going to cast our ballots in the ballot box.
That's wonderful. My church will, on that Sunday, in Greensboro, we'll have Sunday voting for one day. Some counties won't have that,
all,
but we're going to take our members in caravans to the polls, taking their souls to the polls, and we're encouraging them to not only take your soul to the polls, but take your sister's soul, your mother's soul, your brother's soul, and any other souls that you can to the polls, because it's so important that those of us who are people of faith would cast our ballots. We want to say we believe in this, and we're not going to be deterred because of the laws that have been passed in North Carolina.
And isn't it so interesting how people of faith are also people of creativity?
Yes.
We will find a way to get things done that the opposition doesn't believe that we're capable of getting done.
That's right. That's right.
It's just
and
really
many
something.
churches will have vans available during the week
Yeah.
for senior citizens who cannot go on that Sunday to vote. And
That's
so
exactly right.
several churches will be providing transportation.
That's exactly
and we're
right.
hoping that this will continue throughout that early voting. The other thing we're encouraging young people to do, particularly those who are in college, is to march to the polls. One day, Bennett College always marches to the poll, which is about 2 blocks away. A&T, which is about 6 blocks away from where they'll vote, will march to the polls. So we're encouraging college
Young people, yeah.
students across the state of North Carolina to take your students to the polls on that day.
Certainly.
Cast that vote. In Elizabeth City, they've managed to elect a young man who was at one time president of the NAACP youth college chapter out there to the city council. And so young people, you know, have a lot at stake here too, because when we talk about what will happen with their student loans, it's so important for them to vote. And send the right people to whether it's just to their General Assembly, to the local county commissioners, what have you, or even to Congress. So it's so important for them to vote.
Right.
Now, what else do you think the NAACP has planned for getting out to vote?
Well, I know that some of that, another one of the things that we are going to be doing is certainly canvassing this area until, October 10th to make sure that we get as many people registered to vote as possible. But I think some of the things that are being done and some of the information that we are gathering together, such as the new, what they're calling the RAE, the Rising American Electorate. It's very, very important for us to seek out those individuals who have never been of a mind to get out to vote. These are the ones who are going to be the new majority very soon and very soon. And so the initiatives that are going forth from the North Carolina NAACP, such as the recent moral freedom movement that took place this past summer with the young people getting into 50 of the counties here in the state of North Carolina to canvass areas and register people to vote. Very, very important, very key. So we're continuing to be that organization that is par excellence, the civil rights organization of civil rights organizations.
Yes, and you know, sometimes citizens tend to sit in the barbershop and the beauty shops and complain after the election. But we want to say you owe it to yourselves and to your families and neighbors and friends to make North Carolina the state that we know it's capable of being. You know, I was just so elated as I thought about just this week the fact that the last time I visited the Congress when Helms was there as senator, we had to run him down in the hall in order to talk to him. He would not stop to talk with us. We just literally ran after him in order to get him to talk to us. And he stood in the hall for a minute and said, I have another meeting I have to go to. But we did follow him and tell him what we were there for. Now, it makes a difference.
Roll that forward, and that's the same thing that happened with Dr. Barber and Tom Tillis.
Yes, yes.
Most
and so
recently.
you should not have to do that in order to speak to the person that you've elected, or the citizens in your state have elected to represent you. And so now when we look at the people that will make a difference for us, that will sit down in their offices and talk with us about our issues, it makes a difference. It's about respecting people. It's letting people know that you value them, you value their issues and their concerns. And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that people like Tom Tillis don't represent us in the Senate of the United States of America. Now, of course, the NAACP is nonpartisan, and we don't endorse candidates, but we do speak against those that do not support our issues.
You know, back in February, the Honorable Julian Bond referred to voter suppression as the most pressing domestic issue American democracy currently faces. And certainly, you and I, as plaintiffs in the case, certainly believe that wholeheartedly. Yeah. And one of the things that I have begun telling people that come to me and say that they're not going to vote, their vote won't make a difference, you know, that I cringe whenever I hear someone who has been marginalized say that. I understand it, but I cringe. It makes me cringe. And I tell them, you know, a non-voter is a volunteer slave. And often that's enough to jar them into really beginning to think about and think through why it is so important and critical for them to get out to vote during this midterm election. This election, probably more than any other in my time, and perhaps your time too, is one of the most important that we will ever see.
That's correct.
And so it's important for us to do all that we can to get as many people out to vote as we possibly can. That's one of the reasons why I'm going to exercise my right to get out on October 23rd, the first day of early voting. I'm going to turn around and I'm going to get as many people to the polling place between that time and November 4th as I possibly can.
And let me say this before we get to the point of voting. We still want to encourage people to register to vote.
Of course.
They have until October 10th in order to do that. So if they're not registered to vote, we certainly want to encourage them to go out, register to vote. If you certainly can't get out, if you are homebound or what have you, if you call a local NAACP office, they will send someone over to register you to vote. Sure. It's just that important to us. And so we encourage every citizen. The most important thing that you can do is cast a ballot in the United States of America. That's right. Because that ballot makes the difference in lives and communities. Yes. And whatever you do on election day will determine what will happen for you for the next 2, 4, and even 8 years in some instances.
Exactly. So hopefully you've gleaned from us here today how important it is to get out to vote. That voting is not just a privilege, it is also a duty. It is our sacred right to get out to vote. And we want you also to be reminded, a couple of years ago, our leader here in this state of North Carolina, the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, has said to us, if we ever needed to vote before, we sure do need to now. And so it was almost prophetic 2 years ago that we're saying the same thing today.
In the testimony circle of my faith tradition, the saints often declare, if we ever needed the Lord, we sure do need him now. I want to, in the tradition of the hip-hop tradition, sample from that faith tradition and say, if we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. For us, the right to vote is not just a constitutional matter, but a right born out of struggle, out of sacrifice, and a gift from the God of justice, who 2,600 years ago had his prophets say, to every nation you must do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God. And 2,000 years ago had his son say that the least of these must be at the center of public policy. Think for a moment where we are in the time in which we're in, and you will understand why, if we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. Here we are 393 years since the first ship landed in Virginia to bring slaves. 242 years ago, Crispus Attucks was the first African American to die fighting for this country. 236 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. 225 years since the Constitution was adopted. 225 years since we were fractionized in that Constitution and called 3/5 of a person. 183 years since Mexico outlawed slavery, and 176 years since Texas revolted because they wanted to keep their slaves. 163 years since Harriet Tubman escaped slavery. 160 years since Frederick Douglass delivered that America's July 4th celebration was fraud, bombast, hypocrisy until America did right by the sons and daughters of slaves. 149 years since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. 147 years since the end of the Civil War. 142 years since the ratification of the 15th Amendment. 118 years since the riots of Wilmington, North Carolina to stop black political power. 108 years since the riots in Springfield, Illinois. 68 years since Smith versus Allwright opened up primaries for black people. 68 years since Primus King was denied the right to vote in Georgia. 58 years since Brown versus Board of Education. 57 years since the brutal murder of Emmett Till. 52 years since the sittings in Greensboro. 48 years since Fannie Lou Hamer said there comes a time when you get sick and tired of being sick and tired. 51 years since Dr. King said to the AFL-CIO that the only voting bloc that could transform America would be for blacks and labor and poor whites and Latinos to learn how to work together. 49 years since the murder of Medgar Evers. 49 years since the March on Washington. 49 years since the bombing of 4 girls in a Birmingham church. 48 years since the signing of the Civil Rights Act. 47 years since Bloody Sunday. 47 years since the Voting Rights Act. 47 years since Malcolm X was killed. 44 years since students at South Carolina State were massacred. 44 years since the assassination of Martin Luther King. 44 years since the signing of the Fair Housing Act. 43 years since conservatives dismantled the Office of Economic Opportunity. 43 years since my parents fought to integrate public schools. 3 years since Barack, whose name means praise the Lord, was sworn in to be president of these United States. We have been through too much and seen too much and fought for too much. If we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. I don't know if Republicans are going to show up. I don't know if Democrats are going to show up. But the sons and daughters of slaves, we better the hell show up. Because God is not going to do for us what we can do for ourselves. We ever needed to vote, we sure need to vote now. And when we do what we're supposed to do, God will show up. God will bless our efforts. He's always has. He always will. When we work our faith, faith is what you believe about God. Works is what you do because of what you believe about God. Faith without works is destitute and devoid. But faith with works is dynamic and can change your destiny. Whenever we work our faith, God shows up. So from now until November, email everybody you know. Tell them to show up. Text everybody. Tell them to show up. Call everybody you know. Knock on everybody's door. I don't know how to tweet, but my children adora can tweet. So I told them to tweet everybody. You know. Now tell your neighbor, if we ever needed to vote, we sure enough need to vote right now. And God will show up.